Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, we'll study how the United States raised and trained the vast army that would become the American Expeditionary Force. What type of man served in the army? How was the army trained and equipped? And how effective was the average AEF unit on its arrival in France? Hello again, Dan. It's part 2 of our mini set within the series where we're looking at the experiences of the American Expeditionary Force and the Doughboys. And last time out, we looked at why America declared war and the build up to this monumental decision. And we actually ended that episode a little bit of a cliffhanger with the first American troops arriving in France with this promise of a word we used a lot in the last episode, a promise of potential. And this week, it's going to be interesting because it's about how did that potential strength, that potential size and quality of the army actually get translated into the American Expeditionary Force. And it's quite a complex and I would say not actually a very well-known story.
Yes, hi Spence, true, absolutely. I mean, one of those that I think, I'm really glad that we're actually going to cover this subject because as you say, it's not something that's particularly well known, certainly here in Europe, but even in the US as well. And so a chance to kind of dive into that and unpick the intricacies of the AEF and look at the individual Doughboy at the same time really gives us a great opportunity to kind of tell that story. And I think maybe the best thing to do is just to recap briefly in terms of what we're looking at as the army as a whole. I mean, we're talking about what's eventually going to be 4.17 million men in uniform. So let's just take a quick look at these 4.17 million men, though, Spence. I mean, what exactly were their motivations? Why are they enlisting? And how exactly does that whole process of training begin?
The essence of the American army when the war breaks out, what's really driving it is a tremendous wave of enthusiasm. Despite the fact that America's been neutral for the first half of the war, gradually public opinion has been moving more and more in the direction that America should enter the war on the side of the Allies. And so when war is actually declared, it's not a huge surprise within America. Relations with Germany are very poor because of the submarine campaign. America's broken diplomatic relations in February 1917. So the declaration in April is not a complete surprise. And the reaction in America is one of huge public appetite for the war. It's seen in really, really national terms. It's seen as a national adventure. A way for you to test your manhood if you're a young man, a way for the manhood of America in a very broad sense to be put to the test as their forefathers had been in the Wild West or in the American Civil War. It was a way, and as history would show, would actually prove correct. It was a way for America to show its place in the world, for it to show that this was a major power now, not a distant power from Europe, but a major world player. And other people saw it as a continuation of this concept of manifest destiny, that America was a unique country. It had a unique destiny to fulfill, that it was an expansionist destiny, and that this was the next logical step, having settled the entirety of the United States, having expanded in certain directions, Cuba and the Philippines. Where's next for the United States to go? Obviously, it's going to go back to the old world and it's going to intervene there. And we've talked many times on this podcast about how for volunteers, whether they're British or indeed from other nations, this is an adventure, a chance to do something completely unlikely that you'd never have dreamt of before this war broke out. And in America, this idea of going off and fighting in this huge national war has an extra element because the legacy of the US Civil War is still immensely strong in 1917. There's quite a few veterans, in fact, still alive from that conflict in 1917, many of whom play a role in encouraging men to actually be part of this new army that is going over to fight in Europe. And at a political level, some politicians see this as a way to heal the last wounds of the American Civil War by getting Northerners and Southerners to fight side by side, sometimes even in the same division, and put together a truly national US army. And so you've got all these very powerful forces and themes coming together, which means that the war is greeted as a a really huge national event. And I think that's something that's been largely forgotten because, of course, in America, the Second World War so massively overshadows the first. But in 1917, this is probably the biggest international event in US history, probably since the War of Independence.
Yeah, I mean, exactly, Spence. One of the fascinating things about the story of the US, in some senses, we've covered this, as you say, many times. The idea of these guys being adventurers, and in Britain, we know the regular private soldier, in many cases, never left their home county, let alone their home country. Now, the story in the US is slightly different because it's got that such high immigrant population. About 1 in 5 first generation, who we know have actually taken the opportunity to make a big change in their lives. They've already crossed oceans and engaged in a new and exciting world. So for some, at least, there is that kind of pre-existing sense of adventure and perhaps a desire to return to that. But for others, as you say, there's really not. I mean, there are guys that go way back. Their stories are generations back to either the North or the South, and of course have family ties to the Civil War, which in a sense is also interesting because we're not talking a million years before or after the Civil War. In fact, is there an argument? You've spent a lot of time there in the States, but is there an argument to say that the whole North and South, Union and Confederate, is there still some vestiges of that in the military at the time?
I think it's fair to say there is. And in a very, very small army, of course, the US Army and National Guard, maybe about 200,000 men when the war breaks out. It's very small. And the legacy, of course, of the Civil War is still well within living memory. And not just the war, but also what comes after, the very contested Reconstruction period. And although there's not going to be another civil war in 1917, there is a very distinct difference between North and South, really distinct. And travelers who go in either direction and cross the Mason-Dixon line all comment on this, that attitudes are different, the cities are different, the language is different. If you're from the northeast of the United States and you travel to, say, the deep south of the US, you travel down to Alabama or so on, in some cases it's difficult to actually be understood and have others understand you. That's how strong the accents are as you cross the US. And of course, you also have the Jim Crow laws, these discriminatory laws against African Americans, which I'm sure we'll come on to in a moment, which are very, very strong, especially in the South. And so there's tension between the North and the South. They are still almost two countries within a wider nation. And whether that affected individuals quite so much, not so clear, but certainly at a political level, that there's an awareness of this very different attitude on either side of the Mason-Dixon line. And so the First World War, by bringing these two different attitudes within America together for a single national cause and explicitly a United States cause, is seen as really politically appealing. And it actually works, even though there's an awful lot of throwing back and calling back to the legacy of the Civil War, as I mentioned, including veterans suggesting go and volunteer, or in some cases, celebrated veterans even say, I'm prepared to go to France and I'm 70 years old. What about all these young men? Where are they going? Where are the sons of Arkansas now, etc.? This legacy is extremely powerful. And crucially, I think the idea that any lingering wounds can be healed by this all-out national effort that's going to bring everybody together is a really, really appealing one. And when you add on to that this tremendous sense of adventure, a chance for you to go to Europe, which for some Americans, if you're not an early immigrant, if you've been in America for many, many generations, Europe is literally the other side of the world. It is an unknown, exotic land, and you're going to go out there and you're going to fight, you're going to meet new people, you're going to be in an incredible national adventure. It's a seductive combination, and it's little wonder, I think, that it leads to widespread volunteerism almost as soon as the war's declared.
And what's really fascinating about that, if we compare that with, say, Britain and its journey through volunteerism in the early part of the war, this is 1917, going into 1918, we're still seeing volunteers at this point. This is a point when, by now, British volunteerism has basically fallen away. People are well aware of what they're getting themselves into, and I think that's even more remarkable. By 1917, 1918, Americans, albeit they're far away, are well and truly aware of just how horrific the war on the Western Front is. And I think it really stands the test of time in terms of the courage and the spirit of the doughboys of the AEF, that they're still willing to volunteer so late on into a massive global war.
It speaks to two things, I think. One, this idea of national spirit and incredible adventure. And secondly, it speaks of something that's going to be a problem for the AEF. And this is a certain amount of ignorance. Because although the Americans read about the war in the news, although there are American observers out in France who are sending information back, the extent to which this information and the reality of war has really spread through America is extremely limited. It's not the case as it is in other parts of Europe, so France, Britain, Germany, where the war is obvious, its effects are constant, whether it's rationing or you're seeing wounded soldiers on the street, you're seeing men who've lost, their eyes, their arms, their legs. You can't escape from that reality. In America, the reality of combat, the violence of it, the casualties are not anywhere near as well understood as they are in Europe. And so these two things combine, the idea of a national adventure, certain amount of ignorance about what the war's really like, and a third factor, what we might call American exceptionalism. That America is not part of Europe. It is the new world. It has a different attitude. It has different outlook, even with its waves of immigrants. These are immigrants who are trying to leave Europe and start a new life elsewhere. The American attitude to life, business, and war is very different. And the idea that the American army is going to be something different, that it's going to be elite almost from the first moment it forms, and that it is going to be the decisive force that breaks the deadlock on the Western Front, almost immediately becomes a very, very powerful and seductive idea. Problem is, of course, it's one thing to have, as the British found out way back in 1914 and 15. It's one thing to have a mass volunteer army. It's another thing to actually turn this mass of volunteers into a fighting force, train them, equip them, clothe them, feed them, prepare them for battle. And the Americans aren't completely ignorant that relying purely on volunteers is not the way to go. They've seen the example of Britain. They've seen the example of Australia, which maintains an all-volunteer army, of course. And so the Americans actually have a joint system where you can volunteer early on. You can volunteer from the outbreak of war up until late 1917, but the bulk of the army will be draftees and conscripts. And this is done quite deliberately to, one, ease problems with the American labor supply, so you don't get all the skilled workmen joining up as it happened in Britain. And also, it's a recognition that the American army could be fighting for years. Generally, the American high command thinks that the war won't end until at least 1919. They're going to need a lot of replacements. They're not ignorant about the idea there's going to be heavy casualties. So a draft system is introduced instead. And it's ultimately that's going to raise the army. But the numbers are enormous. We've mentioned before, 4.17 million men in the AEF by the end of the war, in a nation that has no tradition of a mass military. You'd have to go back to the Civil War to find that. Doesn't have the facilities, doesn't have the equipment, doesn't have the training centers, doesn't have the people to train it. And one of the most fascinating stories, I think, of the AEF is how they go from really a standing start, a complete standing start, and yet manage to produce this mass army. And it's not an easy process.
I think you've summed up the situation really well there. And in my mind's eye, we've got a picture here of this huge but untrained and fairly untapped resource, massive amounts of manpower. And they're going to need to somehow be converted into this excellent fighting force that can go out and stand up against perhaps one of the greatest fighting force in the world at the time, which of course is going to be the German army. So it's going to be a huge task. And as we kind of go through this journey over the next, the remainder of this episode, it's going to be great to see how that kind of comes about. But just before we do that, Spence, I just want to touch on this pool of manpower again, because it's worth pointing out here that, first of all, that conscription, when it's first introduced, is actually over a fairly limited range. And this speaks to America's ability to raise large amounts of troops, rather than the Brits, as they do in 1914, where they can basically take volunteers or people can join the army from the age of 18 to 38 or 39, later on widened. When conscription first comes in, that pool is only 10 years wide. So it's men from 21 to 31. It will later be widened to draw in more conscripts, but that's a pretty dedicated pool. And within that number as well, we've of course got people from all different backgrounds. And this maybe gets to the I think, perhaps one of the awkward points of this episode, because things in the US in 1917 and 1918, they're certainly not perfect. And many groups are going to feel the wrong side of that particular line. And actually, it's an important subject to cover in the context of the raising of the AEF.
It is. And it's quite interesting that at the time when the AF's being raised, the big concern for both the army and quite a number of American politicians are the so called hyphenated Americans, first generation immigrants, wherever they may have come from. And whether they are going to be loyal to the cause, whether they can speak and understand English, whether they're going to be willing to fight. And as we mentioned in previous episodes, 1 in 5 of the American army will be a first generation immigrant. And while there's some tensions there, particularly with German speaking immigrants, in general, those problems are overcome relatively easily. In fact, the biggest tensions within the American army won't be with the immigrants, it will be with marginalized groups who are already within the United States. And in some cases, have been there a lot longer than white settlers. The first and in some ways the most obvious are the Native Americans. The Western frontier is only recently been eradicated by the American westward expansion. You have Native Americans living on reservations. And curiously, at this stage, Native Americans aren't necessarily US citizens, and the legal process has to be gone through to actually turn them into this, which means they're not eligible for the draft. And you might be forgiven, listeners, for thinking, well, this is an obvious chance for Native Americans to sit out the war. Why would you go and fight for a nation that has eradicated you and forced you onto reservations? But in actual fact, and this is, it seems sort of odd when we just explain it. Native Americans are, in proportionate terms, the ethnic group in the US who are most likely to volunteer. And bear in mind, they can't be drafted, or very few of them can be drafted. So nearly all Native Americans are, by definition, volunteers. About 10,000, 13,000, numbers disagree a little, but 10,000 to 13,000 Native Americans will volunteer for the US Army. There's a number of reasons why they do this. One, life on a reservation in 1917 is pretty grim. Not a lot going on, economically very depressed. Men feel emasculated, culture is being lost. And here's a chance for you to go to war, have an adventure, escape these dreary reservations. And it also taps into a cultural memory that many of the Native Americans have of older warlike traditions from a few decades earlier. But there's also a practical reason, and there's a desire for many Native Americans that by going and fighting as volunteers, they'll improve the status of Native Americans back at home. They'll prove through their own courage and determination that they are worthy of being part of the United States, and that the United States should treat them better. And a quote that I think captures this is from a soldier called Sam Thundercloud, who would survive the war. And when he was asked about why he'd volunteered, he said, "I'm fighting for the rights of a country that has not done right by my people," which is absolutely true. But he'd go on to also explain that he thought that by doing this, it might lead to a redress of the balance. And in fact, so many Native Americans actually volunteer, surprising in some ways the American Army itself, that the US Army briefly considers forming all Native units, thinking they're going to be natural fighters, they're going to share a language, there's going to be a high morale there, but it's not practical, because once those units start taking casualties, it's going to be really difficult for you to actually refill them. So there's no specific Native units. And so instead, Native Americans can be found in American units all over the AEF. And many of them end up in specialized roles, snipers, scouts, and messengers. And they'll fight with great distinction within the AEF. And of the marginalized groups, perhaps it's the Native Americans in the AEF that probably come out of the war with the most improved image. But for other minority groups or marginalized groups in the US, the story's just not the same. Hispanic Americans, there's a vast Hispanic American population, particularly in the South and the Southwest of the United States. They're subject to the draft. Many of them don't speak English, or they speak English relatively poorly. And they are besmirched by all kinds of racial prejudice that views Hispanic Americans as lazy, as indolent, as naturally poor soldiers. On average, they tend to be smaller than white American soldiers, often have poor educational standards. And although hundreds of thousands of Hispanic Americans will serve, there's an unspoken and unofficial color bar involved here, in that Hispanic Americans can fight as soldiers, but very few, if any of them, will become combat officers. It's not considered that they have the right stamp, and so they're part of the wider American army, but they're discriminated against quite heavily. And it has to be said, their position doesn't really improve given their bravery in war. But of all the marginalized groups, it's impossible to discuss this subject without mentioning, of course, African Americans, because they face the worst discrimination of all.
Yes, of course, African Americans. It's the story that really needs to be told, and one that I'm glad we do get a chance to address here, Spence, because it's such an important subject. Of course, slavery is still within living memory at this time. We've got terrible conditions at home. There's racial abuse is rampant throughout the army. It's a product of its time, and it's a really disagreeable time. And for many, they're going to be fighting not only the enemy but also against the traditions and the discrimination of their own army. And that makes, I think, the story of African Americans in the Great War such a powerful one.
It really does. And although the US regular army does have some black soldiers, of course, it's a very, very small army. It doesn't really have much public influence. When you suddenly have the AEF forming and it's going to be drawn from all aspects of American society, a big problem that emerges is ironically something we've just been talking about as a strength of the US Army, that it brings North and South together. The problem with bringing the South in is within the South, at a political and public level, there's intense opposition to using African Americans as soldiers. And this is because, of course, the Jim Crow laws are in place in America, which effectively means America is a segregated society in the South. Blacks and whites do not interact. They do not share the same social spaces, don't share the same educational systems, such as it is for African Americans. And in the South, there's a worry that if you're going to start bringing in black soldiers, teach them how to use guns, teach them how to fight, they're going to come back and they're going to say, well, we don't like this system. I think it's time for us to take matters into our own hands. And so there's a real political concern here and a huge amount of opposition from Southern America to actually having African American troops. And just to put this in a wider context, bear in mind, just a year before the war breaks out, or America enters the war, I should say, in 1917, in 1916, you've had the American silent epic Birth of a Nation. Enormous production, brilliant film of its era in terms as a technical achievement. But the culminating act of this is a portrayal of the Reconstruction era after American Civil War, which has the most appalling racial stereotypes of African Americans who are then summarily dealt with and kicked out of the film effectively by none other than the Ku Klux Klan, who are portrayed as heroes within this hugely popular film. So this is racism of the most virulent type. And the idea of arming African Americans, making them fight, and even, heaven forbid, putting African American NCOs or officers in charge of white troops is politically absolutely anathema to the South, and it must be said, considerable parts of the North as well. But African Americans still represent a very large pool of manpower, and they're going to be subject to the draft. There's also going to be a number of African Americans volunteer as well. And reasons why African Americans volunteer are fascinating, because the Native Americans, you might think, well, why would you fight effectively in an army that had destroyed the Native American way of life? Why would African Americans fight for a nation that kept them segregated? And the reasons in many respects are similar to many volunteer soldiers. It's a chance to escape poverty. Although US Army pay is not particularly high by the standards of the US, it's high for African Americans. You can actually make money in the US Army that potentially you couldn't make in civilian life. There is also this call of adventure. And for some, particularly African American intellectuals, there's a feeling a little bit like the Native Americans had, that by doing this, it's a chance to win the respect of America and perhaps ultimately overcome the prejudices and roll back the laws that are discriminating against African Americans. And so thousands, tens of thousands of African Americans will fight in the US Army. And all these groups, whether you are long-standing Anglo-settler of America, whether you're a Native American, a Hispanic American, African American, a hyphenated American, you're all going to join an army where you're given the nickname Doughboys. And we've used the nickname Doughboys repeatedly at this stage. And it's one that is everywhere in the First World War. It's a sort of fascinating nickname, Dan, but it's one where the exact origins are really obscure.
Yeah, it is. And I've looked at this a couple of times in the past, actually. And just a quick segue on this, we recently did a video over on our Battle Guide YouTube channel, actually, looking at the story of the Lost Battalion, which no doubt we'll cover in this series. And I made in the narrative to that various times reference to the term Doughboys. And I think about the first 5 or 10 comments we got on the YouTube video were, "What's a doughboy?" And so even today, it's not really that well known. I mean, the story as to what a doughboy is and where the name comes from is very interesting. There were actually two names from memory, Spence, that kind of took up within the AEF at the time. One of them was Doughboys, and the other one that kind of rose to prominence about the same time was Sammies. And Sammies actually died out in 1918. In fact, various newspaper articles try to get rid of the term Sammies because they don't like it. We can pretty much gather that one from Uncle Sam, so I think we get an idea of where Sammies might have come from. But Doughboys is far trickier. There's a suggestion, the one that I read most recently, which I think might hold some water, is the original buttons on early American uniforms about the turn of the century looked a little bit like Doughboys, which were kind of a small biscuit-like dough treat. And so the suggestion was that they came from the buttons on American soldiers. Another one might relate to money and the fact that American soldiers get paid very well, and even pre-war got paid very well. No doubt we'll come back to that. What's your take on it? Where do you think it comes from?
It's really intriguing. And listeners, if you've got an idea or you've got a story about this, we'd love to hear it in the comments. But the closest I can see, or the one that I tend to put credence in, goes to the Mexican War in 1846 to 48, where US troops operating in the Southwest and in Mexico, they get covered in dust as they're marching along, relatively light colored dust, and they look as if they're covered in flour, or they have become doughboys, the skin, the dough, the dust, the flour. But I can't prove that. And it's interesting that the term doughboy sort of rises and falls in popularity within the US. And then when the war breaks out, the First World War breaks out, or US joins it, suddenly it's brought back to prominence. And I think perhaps one of the reasons is, unlike Sammy's, which has got a certain negative connotation in that you've only joined because of Uncle Sam, that there's some criticism of that at the time. Doughboys unites you all, and it covers the gamut, as we've said. Doesn't matter what type of American you are. Once you're in the army, once you're uniformed and you're ready for action, you are going to be a doughboy. Now, I should add that for the British and particularly the Australians, actually, the term doughboy becomes something of a term of abuse once the Americans start arriving on the Western Front, because you're soft. You're soft and you're pale and you're not battle hardened. And the British see it as a term of derision, as do the Australians. And some of the squabbles and unpleasant interactions between American and British and Australian troops are anchored on that. But for the Americans, to be a doughboy is very much a badge of pride. It's a badge of honor. It's equivalent to the British Tommy. It's a term of affection and endearment, but it's also a term of pride as well, that you are now a doughboy. You're part of this amazing army. And it's worth sort of reflecting a little bit. You mentioned money, Dan, and that the Americans are well paid. And I mentioned this previously as an inducement for African-American volunteerism. An American private salary is not high by the standards of American civil life, but to put it into context, they're paid a fortune compared to European soldiers. A US private salary is about $360 a year. You won't necessarily take all that home. There's various stoppages for things that you have to pay for, but $360 per year. By comparison, a British soldier earns $89 per year and a French soldier earns $20 per year. So by comparison to European armies, the Americans are almost an army of millionaires.
Yeah, and this is something actually, interestingly, we see before the Americans arrived with the Canadians as well, because Canadians, by British standards, are paid at a very high rate, approaching that of the US. And one of the things we quite often see behind the lines, and actually when you mentioned tensions there between national forces and national armies, I suspect this is one of them, is that when you get a unit that goes into an area, say somebody goes behind the lines to the Arras area, as two American divisions will do when they first arrive on the Western Front, locals find out quite quick. They also find out that you've got quite a lot of money quite quick. And surprise, surprise, the price of everything goes up. And that's great because the locals are making themselves a little bit of money out of it. But then when the poor old British regiment, or even a French one, heaven forbid, comes back into that sector a few weeks later and finds out the price of a loaf of bread, or more importantly, a bottle of wine has gone through the roof, they can no longer afford it. And so this bitterness comes out between these national armies. And you do get these fascinating, I think, conflicts that arise behind the lines between guys who are, and quite often Canadians are referred to as Canadian millionaires. And I suspect, I don't know for sure, but I suspect the AEF have exactly the same problem.
They undoubtedly do. And I'm sure we'll come on to in either later this episode or in future episodes about the tensions between the Americans and their allies, particularly the British and the French, and the Australians and the Canadians, for that matter, when they encounter them. You have very, very different nations, different national armies, different outlooks on life. But one thing that I think also leads to this certain amount of discrimination is that as the Americans arrive on the Western Front, they're coming with no experience of battle at all. They're coming from their training camps in the USA. They're coming in vast numbers, but it's a different army, a different outlook. And they're joining this very battle hardened Western Front, which is packed with veterans from all the other Allied armies. And this is where I think it's a good chance to segue into how does the army train? How does America raise its army? Because we've stressed repeatedly, there's no structure for this army. The pre-war regulars and National Guard, 200,000 men-ish. Suddenly you've got to turn this into an army of millions. And I find the way the US set about their training really fascinating because it's quite unlike any other army. And you might think, well, the US hasn't been in the war until 1917. It's had this wonderful opportunity to watch the war, learn from it, prepare itself for what might happen. And it hasn't done any of that. It's watched the war, and various material has come back from the war. It's had almost no influence on the US Army whatsoever. And so when war breaks out, everything has to be done from scratch. But setting about it in the way that only the USA can do, the US Army is determined to have the most scientific recruitment process of any army in the world. And uniquely, it actually includes an IQ test when you arrive, and which is though there's some assessment of educational and intellectual standards in other armies, this is a genuine test that you'll sit down and you'll take the exam. And about 1.7 million soldiers take this exam. And the idea is, in a very scientific way, you'll take the exam, and depending on how well you're doing it, the army will then assign you to the correct role. Now, this system doesn't prevail for the entire war because casualties make it a little bit moot, but it's a fascinating sort of snapshot about how the Americans do try and approach this in a uniquely scientific way. And there's actually two-tier tests for this. You have a written test if you're sufficiently educated and literate. And if you're not literate, or perhaps you don't even speak English, you're given a picture test. And you have to answer the question, basically a pictorial series that you answer instead. And about 30% of American draftees are considered illiterate. Now, that doesn't mean they can't read and write at all. It might be that English is their second language and so forth. But you have these IQ tests. And I thought, for a bit of fun, listeners, I'm going to read you a question from the literate exam. It's a mental arithmetic question. And so no calculators, although you can use pen and pencil or paper and pencil to work this out. But here's a question, a sample question of many. The question is this. A division contains 3,000 artillerymen, 15,000 infantry, and 1,000 cavalrymen. If each branch is expanded proportionally until there are, all in all, 20,900 men, how many will be added to the artillery? Do you fancy your chances in answering that one, Dan?
No, I don't. That's the first time I've seen it. I'm reading it now, and with the microphone on, the pressure in front of me, I don't think I'm even going to hazard a guess. But I'm sure there's some listeners, by the time I've even said this, who've worked out the answer. It's actually fascinating, Spence, that the US and the Americans, they're going to be looking at people in this way, and they're going to, I guess, use this to kind of weed out those who are not going to be suitable for certain branches of service. How fitting that is when it comes to fighting on the battlefield, I think, is a different story, because, of course, an IQ test is not going to tell you anything about the courage or your spirit or your morale or your physicality. All of those, of course, are really important factors. In fact, the physicality is a really interesting one, because we've discussed this many times when we talk about those fighting from the Commonwealth coming to join the British Army. British Army generally smaller than most of those from Commonwealth countries. Is the same thing true of Americans?
It is. And the average height of the American soldier makes them amongst the tallest armies of all the combatant powers. The average height of a Doughboy is 5'7". The average weight is about 141 pounds, which is big by the standards of Europe. And in fact, one of the things that's commented upon as the AAF begins to arrive is these men are big and they look well fed, which broadly speaking, they are. And just a little interesting note for those of you from Texas, the American Army assesses which is the tallest state, and the Texans come out as the tallest soldier on average. So the old saying, everything's bigger in Texas, is absolutely true, certainly for the Texans of the AAF. And you made a really great point, Dan, that IQ and intellectual tests, very scientific by the standards of 1917, but they don't tell you the full story. Got IQ tests, you've got clearly physically very fit men, but physical fitness and courage and even IQ is not enough on its own. You have to pair this with very, very intense training. You have to, as the British, the French, even the Germans have learned, courage alone is not enough in the First World War. Physicality is not enough. IQ isn't enough. It has to be paired in full training. And this is where the Americans are going to have enormous trouble because you've mentioned repeatedly now, there's no system for this. There's no pre-existing model for them to build on, and everything has to be done from scratch. 32 huge, and I mean seriously huge. They can hold somewhere in the region of 50,000 men, maybe even more in certain camps. 32 of these huge army training camps are constructed from scratch around the United States. And interestingly enough, about half of them are still in military use in some way, shape, or form. These camps are set up to deal with this huge influx of draftees and volunteers. But the Americans, despite doing all they can to avoid the problems the British have, they're going to run into all kinds of difficulty because there just isn't the structure, there isn't the system here to train troops. And the training program that's in place is a twofold training program. If you're a man, you're given 16 weeks training. If you're an officer, you're taken away for a special 90-day training course, which leads to the derogatory term from Americans for their own officers, 90-day wonders. But as well as there not being a lot of structure to actually put these troops in, everything's having to be built from scratch. There's this other huge problem that's going to bedevil the Americans really right through the First World War. And that's this tension between the way, particularly Pershing, the commander of the AAF, wants to fight, and most of his subordinates share this view, and the reality of war on the Western Front.
Yeah, and we're going to see this certainly as we play out the rest of the series. It reminds me of General Bullard, who later on will go on to command the Second Army of the AEF. And he's going to be famous for saying, I think it might even be Douglas MacArthur who makes this quote about him in the post-war years. They say there's only two things we know about Bullard. He's got one speed, and that's fast, and he's got one direction, and that's forward. So this kind of, in a sense, I think, obviously hugely generalizing, but this gives you a little bit of an idea. It's quite interesting how the Brits and the French, they've adapted and they've certainly been far from perfect in the early years of the war, but through some very bloody lessons, as we've previously established, have started to adapt the way that they fight. And going forward isn't necessarily always the best thing to do. And certainly doing it quickly isn't necessarily always the best thing to do. You bring up that phrase again, American exceptionalism. There is a real feeling within the AEF that a big, determined force, well-fed, with high morale, can go through and blast through the German defenses. Well, that's a very, very noble intention. Unfortunately, it's just not practical on the ground.
No, it's not. And this idea of American exceptionalism infuses a lot of the American high command. Pershing, the best example, he really believes that the reason there's deadlock on the Western Front is because the British and the French are just played out. They're not capable of launching really aggressive operations. They're exhausted. He's rather dismissive of their approach, which is going to involve massive artillery bombardments and then cautious advances. And he thinks there's an American tradition of courage, individual initiative, marksmanship, and aggression. And in some ways there is. And this is because Pershing has grown up in the pre-war army, which its main duty was fighting Native Americans, where the skills of marksmanship, the skills of fieldcraft, the skills of dispersed cavalry and infantry fighting was very important. And so he's grown up with that system. West Point is infused with that system. And on top of this, you've got this strange cultural memory, rather misleading cultural memory of the American Civil War, that the Confederacy was intensely brave and that their infantry assaults always succeeded and that there was a courage to American manhood that is not found in other European nations. For the Allies who are watching this is very disturbing for both the British and the French to actually see the Americans espousing this view. But it's very widely held, and it won't change for the entire war. Just give you a quote here. This is from the head of the American Expeditionary Force's training in July 1918. So this is over a year after the American entry into the war. American units have been in combat. And he sums it up when he says, the tactics and techniques of our allies are not suited to American characteristics or the American mission in this war. The French do not like the rifle. do not know how to use it, and the infantry is too entirely dependent on artillery support. The British infantry lacks initiative and leadership. And apart from broadly dismissing the French and the British Army, real haze, what's fascinating to me is he talks about American characteristics and the American mission, this American exceptionalism again. And unfortunately, that's going to have negative knock-on effects for actual training in the USA. So on top of the fact there's no systems for this and everything has to be done from scratch, a lot of American training, broadly speaking, it's not really relevant for the type of war they're about to fight.
That's right. I mean, we're going to be looking at really a lot of drill. Drill is going to be the foundation, seen as the cornerstone. I think you go back to the US Civil War, you can see the same thing. To make a decent soldier, plenty of drilling, plenty of snap, a lot of focus on the rifle and on marksmanship. Really, by a time in 1917 when the rifle, I think rightly, the head of training in July 1918 was quite right to say that the French do not like the rifle. That's probably quite true. By this time, tactics have moved on and individual riflemen are not really the way that the war is conducted. As a result of that, trench warfare, I think, is somewhat overlooked. The reality of trench warfare, at least. There certainly is. There's trench digging, there's trench construction. I was recently in Fort Moore, formerly Fort Benning, where they've still got the First World War training trenches on post. We went and had a look at them. You can see the exact positions they were in. So we know the AF is understanding the idea of the battlefield they're going to fight in, at least in principle. But when it comes to actually fighting and actually understanding how to advance across that ground, how to work with artillery, and particularly, Spence, with combined arms, this, I think, is where the training really starts to fall down.
Unfortunately, you're absolutely right. And there's a number of reasons why this is the case. For a start, one of the reasons the Americans drill so much is that they have a citizen army. Very, very, very few Americans have any experience of being in a military at all. They need to be taught basic things. And the way you do that in any army is you drill your troops. The problem is, once you've drilled your troops to a degree, then you put them into advanced training. And that's not something that we see very much for the AF in America. And the reason for that is there just aren't any instructors to actually deliver that advanced training. The army is going from scratch. There aren't people who know what they're doing. The supply of pre-war officers is exhausted almost immediately. The Americans declare war. And so you've got very inexperienced officers teaching equally inexperienced soldiers. The officers don't know any advanced training. So what do you do when you don't know what you're doing? You do what you do know. You drill your troops. And you made a great point, Dan, about there are trenches. The Americans construct lavish trench recreations out there. They then train in them in quite a bizarre way, basically sort of running from one trench to the other, bayoneting sandbagged men in there and cheering and capturing the position. And it's not realistic at all. Your trench fighting is a skill in itself. It's bitterly hard, really difficult, close range, brutal combat. Running around trenches, gleefully bayoneting sandbags is not it. But the point you made about combined arms training, this is the ultimate weakness of the US Army. And it's weakness that comes from what we've already discussed, lack of instructors, but also something we haven't really mentioned, and that's lack of equipment. Because the US Army is really small, it just doesn't have the weapons and material available to equip this fledgling force. And we read about all kinds of ludicrous examples where you have American infantry who don't have any kind of gun at all. They've got a wooden cutout of a gun. In some cases, they've got totally obsolete weapons. Canada very helpfully provides a large number of Ross rifles, which is a Canadian manufactured rifle, notorious as probably the worst rifle used by any major army in the First World War. The Canadians have ditched them as a weapon. No Canadian soldiers to use them, but the Canadians donate these useless guns to the Americans. There's a whole bunch of Russian rifles the Americans were manufacturing for the revolution that get issued as well. But in many cases, you're lucky if you're actually given a working gun. And if it's bad for the infantry, it's even worse for the artillery, because the artillery park is tiny, a few hundred guns across the entire USA, and you're going to need tens of thousands of these. And incredibly, Dan, I found at least one example of a US battery training with muzzle-loading Civil War cannons whilst they're in the USA. And there's just no way you can recreate anything approaching the combined arms, the creeping barrages, the reactive fire, the box barrages, all these things that are essential on the Western Front.
Yeah, and at risk of becoming a bit of an American bashing episode, which it absolutely shouldn't be. I mean, you can understand why the American army is going to struggle so much at this time. As you say, that massive shortage of equipment. You've got a hugely scientific war going on the Western Front. And I think most crucially, that war is still evolving whilst the Americans are beginning to train. So in April 1917, a certain set of tactics are used. There are different types of box barrage and things like that that are being introduced on a weekly basis on the Western Front. Now, all of that has to be understood, translated, taken back across the Atlantic, put into the hands of somebody who understands it in the US, in a training camp, who doesn't have any experience firsthand of doing it, and get to grips with all of that and then translate it down to the troops under their command. That is an incredibly difficult thing to do. So there's no wonder when the original Doughboys and the first contingent, really for the first year of the war, start to try to understand their trade, that the focus really is on the basics, getting these guys up to scratch on the basics, and then hoping that by the time they get over to France, there'll be a better understanding. The problem with that is by the time you get over to France in the middle of 1918, things have changed yet again. Yes, we still have trenches. We still have continual lines as they look on a map, as you might have seen them in 1915 or 1916. But the whole way of fighting, and particularly the way of German defense, has changed yet again, and they're no longer using continual lines. It's an incredibly difficult thing. And to my mind, there's absolutely no surprise that Americans struggle with this. In fact, I find it hard to imagine a situation where they could have done better. Perhaps sending observers earlier, bringing them back quicker, and maybe a slight reluctance there to listen to the advice of both British and French advisors, who, by the way, are pretty willing to offer advice.
They are, and this is in some ways a sort of tragedy, really, for the Allies, because the British and the French are well aware that the Americans are going to have problems doing this. Despite the immense American confidence, the British, especially having gone through this themselves, are thinking this is going to be much, much tougher than the American army realizes. And so the British and the French send over hundreds of instructors, officers, NCOs, and men. And interestingly, the vast majority of these officers who go over are wounded to the point that they can't serve in the front line anymore. These are people who perhaps lost an eye, maybe lost a hand, maybe lost part of their arm. These are guys who've been at the sharpest of sharp ends. And they come over very willing to try and teach the Americans things, try and show them the reality of war. Of course, it's difficult because even though hundreds of these men come across the Atlantic, they're relatively small in small numbers within the wider American army. But they also meet a very mixed reception. In some cases, they find Americans really keen to learn from them. They want to quiz them about every single aspect of the war. But I would probably say the majority of cases, they arrive and they're not exactly dismissed, but they're listened to. The Americans nod and, purse their lips and go, very good, but we're going to do it differently. And there's a great quote from a French instructor who's attached to 26th US Division. It sums it up brilliantly about the difficulties the British and the French have in getting any lessons over to the Americans, when he remembered Americans realize they have a lot to learn, but don't want anyone to tell them so. And it's that spirit of American exceptionalism again coming to the fore, I think, Dan.
Yeah, it's just quite a stinging rebuke there, but a very interesting one as well. And it's one of those situations when if you say set a date, if you like, to this, if we get towards the end of 1917, in towards 1918 now, on the eve of the first units starting to make their way out to France, and you've got to ask yourself, well, those guys loading on those earliest ships who are going to make their way out to France and eventually go into the front line, to your mind, Spence, are they ready for what they're going to experience?
I don't think they are. And if you don't take my word for it, listeners, perhaps you'll take the word of Pershing himself, because Pershing recognizes very quickly that the training in the US is not really preparing his formation for war. And there's other problems that we could go on for a great length. One of the big problems the American army has, and we'll look at this, I'm sure, in future episodes, is its officers and its NCOs are as inexperienced as their men. There's no corps of officers they can really plug into. And crucially, there's no NCO corps. That's something that even the British had to a considerable extent when they raised their volunteer army. But America doesn't have that. And American officers go through a special 90-day training course. become known as 90-day wonders, or Sam Browns after the belts that they wear, the Sam Brown belt. But officer training's as poor as that for the men. And to quote an F.L. Miller, who went through his training in the South, he remembered his officer training was 3 months spent learning wigwag and semaphore signaling and reenacting Civil War combat problems through the mosquito-filled swamps of Arkansas. Not really the best preparation for the Western Front. And on top of that, you've got no real NCO corps either. Because there's no pre-existing NCO corps, the one that exists is immediately swallowed by the army. You're basically reduced to just selecting people and going, well, you're an NCO now. You're going to be a corporal or a sergeant. And where possible, this was tied to the IQ tests we mentioned, or if you were in civilian life, you had some authority, like if you're in charge of a group of ranch hands or you're in charge of a small office or something, you'll make a good NCO, we'll put you in charge. But NCOs had almost no training, and their authority over their men was really low, and their relations with their officers were never quite clearly laid out. And in fact, the British and the French, analyzing the American army in the US, they worry most about this, that the officer corps and the NCO corps is just totally inexperienced and doesn't really function in the way that their armies do. And French instructor in the US remembered in a report, actually, the American NCOs have no authority and no influence over their men. Their situation is scarcely more than that of a corporal in the French army. And that means that these officers and NCOs are going to have to go through a really brutal learning curve. And so to go back to your question, Dan, about is the army ready? When it arrives in France, it's absolutely not. Pershing and his staff, it's quite clear the army isn't ready for major operations. And so Pershing actually sets up an additional training program within France, another 4-month training course. Once the divisions arrive, you've had 4 months in the US, 4 months in France, so 8 months training. That's much more reasonable. And it's going to include, crucially, as well as training behind the lines, it's also going to include tours of the trenches to help season the men. And this is considered essential, not only by Pershing, but also, of course, by the British and above all else, the French, who want to get the Americans in the line as fast as they can. For practical reasons, it relieves French troops, but also to actually allow the Americans to see what is the Western Front like. And this is where most American soldiers are going to get their first taste of not exactly action. They're certainly going to get their first whiff of gunpowder during this training process where they enter, particularly French trenches.
Yeah, that's right. And this does, I think, in a sense, get mirrored in both the British and French armies, and in fact the German ones, because it's become clear really by 1915 and certainly by March of 1916 that you cannot take new unseasoned troops, particularly those lacking experienced NCOs and officers, and put them into one of the heavily active areas of the Western Front. It is just not going to go well. It's something that Australians have learnt to their cost. It's something that the Brits have done. They started integrating really as early as the middle of 1915, integrating fresh units in with more experienced units. And nobody wants to see the Americans fail. They want to see them learn. They want to see them take on ever heavier burden on the Western Front, and eventually that's exactly what they'll do. But first of all, they've got to get in the line, and putting them into a quiet sector, sometimes referred to as nursery sectors, is actually going to be the smart way to do that. And it's simply to learn how to live and operate in trench warfare. Not necessarily how to attack, not necessarily how to defend a formal attack, but rather how to walk, how to talk, how to live, how to move about in a trench system, how to operate at night. All of these kind of things, they're done under fire, but they're done under fire in at least a certain restricted sense, because these Americans are going to go into quieter sectors. And I think it's absolutely the right thing to do. And by dipping in and out for ever increasing longer periods, start to build up that vital experience which is required in order to survive on the Western Front. Now, that being said, a new unit, whether they're American, whether they're French, whether they're British, is a great target for the Germans. And they certainly are going to, whenever they find out there's a new unit in the line, you can be absolutely certain they're going to put them to the test.
They are. And in fact, sometimes the Americans bring this test upon themselves, because when the American units first start arriving and being put into the so-called nursery sectors, the French are quite keen to put them in a real backwater of the Western Front, which is the Alsace-Lorraine sector. And nothing happens on the Alsace-Lorraine sector. Troop densities are very low. There's actually game birds and fruit trees exist in parts of no man's land. soldiers actually chop down hay and grass and things like this in the area. It's nothing happens. There is what is called a live and let live system here, where the French don't bother the Germans don't bother the French. And in fact, both armies use this area as a resting place for shattered units that have been in major battle. It's not an ideal place to send hyper aggressive American units who are itching for action. And there's some real tension here because the Americans arrive and the first thing they do is they start shooting at Germans and harassing the Germans. And this is not the way the sector's been for years, in fact. And so the Germans start responding too. The Germans launched bombardments and carried out trench raids and carried out all kinds of action and so forth, and really started to take the fight to the Americans. And the Germans as well were curious about what are the Americans like? What is this much vaunted force going to do? Because for the Germans, the image of America, and you see this in all kinds of German propaganda posters and postcards, the Germans, I think, half expect the American army to be about 2/3 cowboys and 1/3 Native Americans. That's the image the Germans have, rooted in the imagery of the Wild West. So Stetsons, six-shooters, and feathered headdresses. And the Germans are actually a little bit surprised that in some cases, the Americans look very much like British or Canadian troops. They're wearing the same style helmet, for example. But they're keen to test them out and actually find out what they're like. And this can actually have some pretty brutal experiences. So the first really big trench raid, there are smaller trench raids before this, but the first really big trench raid hits US 26th Division. Now, this was a division the French were complaining about. Nobody in this division wants to learn. And on the 20th of April, 1918, they get taught a very, very sharp lesson because they're down near the Verdun salient and they get raided by a big, well-organized German assault group that includes stormtroopers. It's a very carefully organized German assault, mixture of gas and heavy artillery bombardment to break up the American defenses. And then several hundred Germans break into the American position. And it is a disaster for 26th Division. 80 men get killed, 195 men wounded, many of them very seriously. And worst of all, 132 prisoners get taken away by the Germans, which is the highest loss, I believe, stand to be correct on this, but I believe it's the highest single loss of prisoners suffered by the Americans up to this point in the war. And so it's a really striking reminder that you're in a real war now. And this is, of course, April 1918. The spring offensives are fully underway. And this new, fresh, inexperienced, but incredibly determined army is about to really face its trial by fire, Dan.
Yeah, that's right. First Corps, who are by now forming, it's worth mentioning, First Corps, the premier force that's going to make its way out to the Western Front, consisting of 1st and 2nd Division, who are actually predominantly formed in France itself. And then you have 26th Div, who are going to be a key feature in most of the major battles to come. And then 41st and the 42nd Rainbow Division. They are also going to be part of this early fight. We should add to that, there's an inclusion, interestingly, in the 2nd Division. There's a number of Marines who are going to be fighting. They have a slightly different training journey. Maybe that's something we'll come back to in a future episode, Spence. But they're more selective. Still struggle with combined arms, but really quite selective in what they do. It's interesting, though, that, as you say, this first baptism of fire, and actually it does have a fairly profound effect on the AEF, because really the first 2 or 3 engagements that Americans are involved in, it's being on the wrong end of fairly heavy trench raids and really does dent morale for a while and offers a fairly sharp awakening to a number of men. What I think is really interesting, though, when by the time we get to the end of that trench raid at Seispray, within 2 months, both 2nd Division and 3rd Division up on the Marne, our next episode in this series, they are going to be in the fight of their lives. And they're actually, just in the space of that one battle, going to go from, I think, the picture that we've painted to a certain extent here, Spence, very green formation, full of courage, full of spirit, full of determination, but sadly lacking in experience and perhaps a little bit of the know-how of how to fight a war on the Western Front. So by the time we finish that fighting in July of 1918, we're going to see the glimmer of the enormous force that is ultimately going to emerge as perhaps the dominant force on the battlefield by November 1918.
And not only the glimmer or the potential, to go back to that word we discussed before, but also both the strengths and the weaknesses of the American army in early spring. And just as we round this up with the last comments, it's worth mentioning that the Pershing's plan for a further 4 months training when the US Army arrives. Very good, very practical. doesn't work because the German spring offensives disrupt it. Only 4 divisions actually get to go through that extended training. US 1st, 2nd, 27th, and 42nd. All of the units will have very much truncated training. And I think this captures something too about how desperate the situation is in spring 1918. We've talked before, covered the spring offensives in other episodes, and it's into probably the greatest crisis of the war since 1914, that this very brave, very determined, very large, but totally inexperienced and green army is about to go into action. And that's, of course, going to be the topic for our podcast next week.
You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon. Great, thanks, mate. Your shoulders must be aching from carrying me in that thing. So
no, I thought it was a decent episode, Dan, and I'll be honest, it might be a bit self-indulgent, but I just find all that really fascinating. The US
we're doing battles next week. There's got to be a battle.